Alrighty, so I think we're just about ready to get things started here. If people want to trickle in, that's also no issue. So, so last week you should have had, or I hope you had, a great time learning about mining and wallets and sort of the intended user experience for different sorts of nodes in the Bitcoin network. And today what we'll be doing, so myself and Erica, who will be joining shortly, is we'll be walking you through sort of where the actual usage of Bitcoin by the global community differs from what might have been intended and what sorts of behaviors might be unintentionally incentivized. So let's just go ahead and kick off into the agenda here. All right, so on our table of contents for today, first thing we're going to do is start off by talking about mining pools, which is sort of the first, perhaps, I don't want to say unexpected, but one of the first things that might come to mind in terms of how you maximize profit as a miner, but is also certainly against the grain of what Bitcoin intended. And so we're going to talk about what that looks like and some potential attacks that can be accomplished with mining pools. We'll move on to talking about forking and double spends, which are sort of the like archetypal sorts of attacks and failures in Bitcoin. So double spends you should be a bit familiar with from the earlier lectures, and forking we've mentioned here and there. So we'll give you some more detail on that. We'll go into censorship, which is a huge issue that is possible in transactional systems nowadays, and is also like a big focus of the like crypto community to prevent censorship. We'll talk about selfish mining, which is something specific to Bitcoin and a very interesting problem. And we'll wrap it up with some selfish mining defenses, which are also very cool to sort of reason through. They can get pretty complicated, but we won't be diving too deep. So yeah. So let's dive right into it. I'll be kicking things off with mining pools here. So what are mining pools, right? So unsurprisingly, mining pools are a means by which individual miners can pool their resources together and essentially all sort of chip in CPU power to solving the same block. So the value prop here is that it reduces variance in mining rewards, right? It's great to be a miner, one might think. You would hope that it's guaranteed rewards, but there's actually a lot of risk in when, if ever, you will see a payout, because you have to sort of deal with the probability of am I not going to mine a block at every possible block. And that risk is, well, essentially it's just, it's negative on the bottom line. It's not good for profit. So we want to reduce risk however we can, and mining pools are a means of doing that. They also introduce a sort of new player into the ecosystem. Now, Bitcoin doesn't care about pool managers or pool operators, which are the individuals that run these like groups of mining nodes. To Bitcoin, a pool manager is the same as any other miner, but it's just worth noting that pools do require this sort of centralized entity, and that should raise a red flag for you. To essentially distribute work, make sure that people are submitting work to the pool and distributing rewards. So when we talk about work in a mining pool, it's necessary to quantify that, right? So in Bitcoin, how did we prove work? Well, it's when we could create a hash of a block with some amount of leading zeros that corresponds to the difficulty value. So in mining, the unit of work, so to speak, is not a valid block, but rather something that's called a share, which is a near valid block. And you're still running proof of work. You're using the same algorithm to create these shares. But now you're just solving it for a lower difficulty. So basically a hash of a block with a nonce that qualifies as a valid share will not necessarily qualify as a valid block. But you can still submit these valid shares to the pool operator. It still shows that you're trying, right? You're running proof of work, and you will be rewarded for these shares. Note that valid blocks are valid shares as well, right? Like if I've got 8 leading zeros of difficulty on a hash that I found, and that's what's like necessary for a full block, then that certainly also clears the condition for a valid share, which only needs, in the example on the slide, 4 leading zeros of difficulty. And the pool is actually sort of blind to this. When you as an individual submit a valid share that actually ends up also being a valid block, you're not awarded extra for this. The pool pays you as if it was just one share, but now you've like contributed income to the pool as a whole that can be shared with everyone. And so we mentioned on the previous slide that pool operators will pay for these shares. There's some like reward involved, and there's actually different reward schemes that can be used here. And there's 2 archetypal ones that we'll be going through. So the 2 most popular to start with are, we have the paper share reward scheme, which is where the pool will pay out at every single share submitted, sort of a set fixed amount. So no matter who you are, if you submit a share, no matter how many shares you submitted previously, you just get paid the same amount as anyone else would have for that share. And that payment amount is basically a function of like the pool's difficulty. So if the pool is, say, like half as difficult as the actual difficulty of the Bitcoin network, then your reward schemes will be like a factor of, or sorry, your rewards per share will be a factor of half as large as what you would get for mining an actual block. And I don't want to say that you'd actually get like half of a full reward. Point is that the sort of relative difficulty of the pool to the mining network is a factor in, and probably like the main factor in the rewards that each miner gets paid out. But so let's break this down, right? This is a very beneficial setup for the miners because it completely eliminates any risk, right? It eliminates any variance in your rewards because you know that at every single share I submit, I get this reward. That's how the scheme works. You don't have to worry about whether or not you found a valid share. Now, who does have to worry about you finding a valid share or not is the pool. Since the pool is paying out every single time a miner submits a share, the pool sort of stomachs the cost of paying before any blocks are found and any income is generated. And there's a problem here that if you think about it, individual miners are actually not incentivized to submit valid blocks because they're paid for whatever shares they submit. So they might just, keep running proof of work, submitting shares to the pool and getting the reward for that. But then once they find a valid block, they could just try to broadcast that to the Bitcoin network, for their own benefit. So the second main reward scheme, or I guess like sort of naive popular one, is the proportional reward scheme, where we basically now we flip who is handling the risk and it's back on the miners. So what happens here is that miners do not get paid for every single share they submit. Rather, miners will all get paid once the pool actually finds a block. So again, when a pool is mining for blocks, you can think about it as just like one big miner. So all of the miners in the pool are all mining on the same block, running proof of work for the same block. So when any one miner finds this in a proportional reward scheme, then all of the miners in the pool, they get paid out and they divvy up the reward for that block that was just found based on how many shares you submitted to that block. So let's say like we're a pool, the last block has just paid out, and now we're starting as a pool proof of work on a new fresh block. And let's say myself as a miner, I've just got like crazy hash power in this pool, and I've actually put up half of the shares that were created in the time that the pool was mining this one block. That means I would get half of the reward of that block because I put in half of the work for that time period. Now, this is great for the pool because now the pool isn't doing that thing where it stomachs having to pay before it gets income. Because again, we only pay out after we actually get a block with a block reward. And all the risk of like, will we or will we not get a block reward, or rather like how long will it take for us to actually solve a block? That uncertainty is all borne by the miners in this case. And low risk for pool operators is great. It means it's likely that this will be, one would think it's likely that this would be implemented widely since it's beneficial for pool operators. So let's dive into the numbers here a bit. Now, bear with me on this slide. I know it's very dense, but we'll walk through it. This right here is going to be a breakdown of sort of You know, according to some very reasonable models, but definitely feel free to poke holes at this in your own time and see if you can come up with your own like expected value model. But we're going to show you like sort of the expected reward for if you're mining in a pool versus solo. These numbers are outdated by a number of days, so they're pretty much exactly accurate. The total hash rate of the network right now is somewhere around 130 million terahashes per second. That's like every miner in the Bitcoin network, their hash power combined culminates in that. Now, let's say you're about to enter the mining game and you buy a pretty much top of the line mining rig, which is Bitmain's Antminer S17. Now, that'll get you 56 terahashes per second, which you can see there is about 4.1 times 10 to the negative seventh of the total hash power of the network, which is a tiny proportion. So if you actually, you can use that as a probability in a geometric sequence to, oh God, I might have actually got the terminology wrong on that. But point is, you can use this as a success probability, right, of whether or not you find a given block and extrapolate that out to see what is the expected waiting time before I actually successfully mine a block. So how many blocks am I going to fail before I finally mine one? And given that proportion of the hash rate, so given that probability of success, it's actually going to take you like 1 and 2.5 million blocks in expectation to successfully mine one, which goes out to about 46.4 years. And this is already making the sort of annual revenue not look too great. It's worth noting, it's actually significantly impactful on the bottom line that in this time, many halvings would occur. In the expected time of 46 years, we'd have 11 halvings, which would bring the block reward down from the 6.5 Bitcoin that it currently is to you see 0.003. So even if we project that in those 46 years, Bitcoin goes to like 100,000, that only gets you about $305 when you actually mine that block, which if you break down into like revenue per year is 657 a year. Now, take this with a grain of salt. There are lots of things that aren't modeled in here. Like obviously the expected price of Bitcoin isn't modeled in here. The change in the expected growth in the network's hash rate isn't modeled in here. But those things would really only push further down on the expected revenue there. It's like a pretty optimistic assumption of Bitcoin's price. Well, that's a subjective statement, but point is like you're really not looking at a very profitable time solo mining, not to mention that we haven't even factored in like ongoing costs of running the rig here. But let's say you were to take yourself to a pool now, right? So you take your Antminer S17 and now you join a pool. And let's assume this pool has about 1/6 of the network's hash rate, which is actually a realistic number. There are pools with around this much, which means in expectation, you'd have to wait 5 blocks before you mine one successfully. So 1 in every 6 blocks you would mine. And since Bitcoin has the difficulty metric set such that blocks are meant to be created every 10 minutes, this means that in expectation, the pool will mine a block every hour. So if we just look at the expected revenue for like this year right now, where currently the block reward is 6.25 Bitcoin, and we'll assume Bitcoin is at 10,000. I know it's a little bit above that right now, but that's like the right order of magnitude. So that means in your 8760 hours in a year times your share of the pool rewards. So that's taking that 56 terahashes a second that you would be contributing to 1/6 of the 130 million total. So you take your proportion of the pool rewards times the number of blocks that the pool will find as a whole. And now you're looking at, over $1,000 a year in revenue. So you can see that simply the effect of not, forcing yourself to wait an uncertain amount of time, your bottom line, like your expected profit, is, greatly impacted by this and is much more stable. So this is very beneficial for miners. They're like strongly incentivized to join pools. But pools aren't necessarily that great. Of course, it's amazing that this severely lowers the barriers for entry for like individual miners. I no longer have to like get so beefy a rig that my expected time till I find my first block is shorter. I can just take my one Antminer S17, which, you know, also costs like $1,500. That's a decent capital investment. And I can just take that and put that in a pool and start like earning money. So it decentralizes control in the network, you would think. But there is a sort of the flip side to that, that now we have to trust this pool manager to coordinate all of these miners, accept their shares, share the valid blocks with the rest of the network, distribute rewards, do so, you know, verifiably, hopefully. But there is the sort of centralized point of failure representing like a bunch of different nodes, which isn't great. And also mining pools do enable some different attacks they can be taken advantage of. So, well, I basically just alluded to it. This slide asks, like, do you think that the way mining pools have set up their own incentive structures that this can be taken advantage of? Or specifically, is there any way that we could sort of play the landscape of different mining pools available as a miner and profit maximize? And the answer is yes. So there's a strategy called pool hopping, where you do that. You just optimize like your expected profit by hopping between different pools at different times. So let's take a look at this graph that we've got going on here. What this graph depicts is is your rewards per share. So like however many shares you contribute to a pool, this is like your total rewards from that pool divided by the number of shares contributed. And so it makes sense that in a proportional pool, the rewards per share for yourself as a miner go down as the total number of shares submitted to the pool since the last block goes up across the network. Because remember, like if in a proportional pool, it takes n shares, like the pool as a whole creates n shares before the valid block is found, and you created like X of those shares, your reward will be X over n of the total rewards for that block. And so what this graph is showing is that as n increases, as the total number of shares submitted to the pool increases, your reward per share is going to go down. Now, on the other side, in a pay per share scheme, it's constant. That's the whole pitch of pay per shares, that you get a constant reward per share. So you know exactly what your profit is meant to be there. And so now as a miner, you might ask yourself, like, okay, like these are essentially the options I have available to me, proportional pools and pay per share pools. Now there are different payment schemes that we're not going to go into, but like given that I've got proportional and pay per share, how do I maximize my profit between the two? Well, so let's focus in on this graph and see what is a miner's profit, right? Well, it's the average rewards per share times the number of shares that they submitted, right? That should check out. So that's actually essentially just the area under each of the curves, right? So in a proportional pool, their profit, if they are to continuously submit their shares only to the proportional pool, this is essentially what their profit will be. It'll be the total area under this curve. Whereas in a pay per share pool, their profit, again, the total number of shares that they submit times the rewards per share is just going to be the area of this rectangle here. And again, so as a miner, I want to maximize profit. Profit is the area under this curve. I want to maximize the area under this curve, which would look something like that, which means that what I would do is I would join a proportional pool. I would submit shares until the point where if I was to submit another share, when the pool pays out, my rewards per share by this point is actually going to be less than if I had just taken my next share and committed it to a pay per share pool. Like there comes a point where it's taken so much time in this proportional pool to mine that block that I'm actually getting better utility on each share submitted in a pay per share pool. And so that's the pool hopping strategy. You just abandon proportional pools the second it takes too long to find the current block. which makes proportional pools not feasible in practice. I guess we could call them proportional pools, because you essentially have a guarantee that all your miners are going to leave you once this point hits. And this point could happen on any block that you're mining if you're unlucky enough for it to take a while to mine that block. And so it's still an open problem in the space, certainly, designing like a well-aligned pool reward scheme that doesn't end up incentivizing pool hopping. Because you can, like, pool hopping essentially always boils down to let me maximize area under a bunch of curves, where all the curves are this reward per share for all the different pool reward schemes out there. And it's not hard to imagine that the sort of most profit maximal way to do that isn't going to be by sticking to just one pool. You're going to want those curves to overlap. If that didn't make too much sense, don't worry about it. You can just focus on this example of proportional and paper share pools, and you see that it is incentivized, unfortunately, for miners to be disloyal. And this actually can get taken a little bit further. So a pool as a whole entity might want its miners to hop on enemy pools. And this is an attack called pool cannibalization, where the strategy is that as a pool operator, you take some amount of your pool's mining power and you spread it equally among the other pools, so that, you know, your miners are like contributing shares to those pools and thus getting paid by those pools and thus sapping resources from them. But your miners will never submit a valid share to those pools, so they never actually effectively contribute to the income of those pools. So you're just sort of leeching away from other pools with your miners. And it's actually very difficult for the receiving pool to detect this unless it's statistically significant, because to them it just looks like, oh cool, I've got miners submitting shares, but for whatever reason we're just not finding valid blocks as often. That's odd. And so let's do a breakdown on this of why it's actually more profitable for pools to cannibalize other pools than to just keep all their mining power within themselves. Now, this is going to get a little nitty gritty, a little bit into the numbers. And so just know that if it goes over your head at one point, or I fail to be very concise, don't have to get too beat up about that, because at the end of the day, pool cannibalization is more incentivized, is the bottom line that we're going to get to. But let's take a toy example. So let's say that as a pool ourselves, we have 30 hashes per second. Every second, we can run proof of work 30 times. And the network as a whole, all the pools in it, can produce 100 hashes a second. And now let's say that right now we've got a 1 Bitcoin block reward, just to keep things simple. So all the numbers in this example are going to be like expected value. They'll be in expectation. So we'll just say that at the onset. So what do we have available to us? We have 30% of the hash rate, right? Which essentially means that for every block that gets created, we created 30% of the hashes that went into that block, which again means that like 30% of the failed hashes before the one valid one was found. Which means, you know, so if we're creating 30% of the hashes that were like attempts at finding each block, that essentially means we've got a 30% chance of finding a given block, right? We put up 30% of the attempts at finding it. So that means that our expected value is going to be 30% of the mining reward, or 0.3 Bitcoin here. Cool, so that's our baseline, right? So now let's say we buy some more mining equipment, or perhaps it's better to think of it as another miner joins our pool, and they've brought with them like an extra 1 hash per second worth of computational power. So if we were to not pool cannibalize, and we were to just add this one miner to our pool, add this 1 hash a second to our own rig essentially, what does the hash rate in the network look like? So now we've got 101 hashes per second being produced by the network, 31 of which we are producing, which means we've got 30.69% of the total hash rate of the network. So again, using the same expected value, that means our expected value, or sorry, our expected reward for each given block is 0.3069 Bitcoin, which means that by adding 1 hash per second, so by increasing the network's hash rate by 1%, we've got a 0.0069 Bitcoin increase in our revenue as a pool. Okay, like, sure, we don't really have any reference for that, but let's see how that compares to if we were to pool cannibalize instead. So this is the pool cannibalization strategy. We take this 1 hash per second and we distribute it amongst the other pools. How you might think about that is that every second we have this miner run their hash at a different pool that is not one of ours. Like, point is, there's a way to split this computational power evenly across the rest of the pools in the network. And what we do is, all the times that we're mining at those other pools, we just don't submit valid blocks. So we submit shares and we get paid for the shares, but we don't submit valid blocks. So how does that affect the problem now, right? So if we take a look at the network's hash rate, so we've got 101 hashes per second in the network as a whole, but know that 1 hash per second, that 1 hash per second that you are having your miner contribute to all the other pools will never actually create a valid block because your miner will never submit that valid block to the other pools. So in the 71 hashes per second that are sort of being crunched out by everyone that is not us in the network, only 70 of those will ever actually potentially create income, which means the effective hash rate of the network is still 100 hashes per second, right? There's still 100 hashes per second that go into actually creating valid blocks. So the other pools, they're crunching out 70 of these effective hashes a second. They've got 70% of the effective hash rate, which means they'll still get 0.7 Bitcoin in expectation for every block. That's their expected reward, sort of the rest of the network if we were to consider them as one pool. But you're still contributing 1/71st of the total work that the other pools are doing. So even though that 1 hash per second that you're giving to the other pools won't ever be a real block, it is still contributing shares to those pools, and they still have to pay you the proper amount for those shares. In this case, the proper amount is 1/71 times the pool's reward, because we're sorry, I guess I should have stated, let's just have this be a paper share pool. But this should make sense. Like, you're contributing 1/71st of the hashes that the other pools are producing. You get a 71st of their expected reward, which is 0.0098 Bitcoin. And this is actually a 42% larger marginal gain than if we just took this 1 hash per second and committed it internally to just crunching out hashes with the rest of the pool. So there's a fairly strong incentive for pools to cannibalize other pools, to sort of maliciously mine within them in this way. And this leads to, I guess, an idea called pool wars. You could sort of view this decision, like at every time step, one might say, a pool is faced with this decision of, like, should I or should I not attack the rest of the network with pool cannibalization? So if we were to model this as a game where we've got 2 players, right, pool 1 and pool 2, this means they'll alternate turns, and at every turn, the pool basically chooses, do I or do I not cannibalize this other pool? Do I send miners there or not? And each iteration of this game is a case of in a sense, it is a case of the prisoner's dilemma, which we won't explain. But it's worth searching up. It's not too complicated. It's essentially a scenario where 2 parties, if they are to cooperate, they will sort of achieve a result that is the greatest common good. It'll be better for both of those parties, but those 2 parties can't trust each other to cooperate, so they default to non-cooperation, resulting in not the universally best scenario. Not a great explanation, but we'll see it in the context of pool mining right now. So what we're talking about here is essentially, it essentially boils down to this game theoretic concept called Nash equilibrium, which is a bit of a mouthful, but you should be able to sort of ingest it, and I'll let it sit with you for a second. So Nash equilibrium in a game is a state of the game in which, and by state of the game, I mean selection of strategies for each player, in which none of the players could earn a higher reward by changing their strategies. So you can't do better by switching off of your current approach, assuming all other players' strategies remain unchanged. So again, a mouthful. Let me show you what it means. Let's take a look at this is a payout matrix, which means just like, you know, on our left axis there, we've got the possible strategies that pool 1 can choose at every turn. And on our upper horizontal axis there, we've got the strategies that pool 2 could choose at every turn. And then we've got the expected payouts for each of the pools for every combination of strategies. And so we've got this cooperative situation in the upper left going on where neither of the pools decide to attack one another, and they just mine within their own pools and produce profit for themselves. And this will bear them like a +3 of these sort of like arbitrary units of revenue. So that's great. Both pools are making +3 revenue. But is this a Nash equilibrium? Well, let's take a look. So let's kind of jump into the perspective of pool 1 here. And so the question is, can I do better by changing my strategy if I assume that pool 2 sticks with the same strategy? Namely, that strategy is pool 2 staying idle. Okay, so I'm assuming pool 2 is staying idle. If I was to change my strategy to attacking, I find that I actually do better. I'm looking at +4 revenue here, +4 reward, because we're also like leeching away resources from pool 2, and that'll also sort of reduce the bottom line for pool 2 and just give it +1 reward. So this isn't net positive in any way. It's not the situation that we would hope these two pools decide on, but it's better for pool 1, and so we can essentially assume that pool 1 will always default to attacking. So you can see like the decisions that pool 1 just made there. Like if I assume pool 2 is idle, I should switch. So the sort of the same thing is running through pool 2's head as we do this. And we find that it's only in that bottom right game state that we're actually at Nash equilibrium. Because take a look there. So we've got pool 1 attacking and pool 2 attacking. So let's sort of go through the same thought process. Pool 1 asks, if I assume that pool 2 is going to stick with the same strategy of attacking, can I do better by switching my strategy? Well, I would go from pool 1 attacking to pool 1 being idle, which would put me from a place where I was earning +2 as pool 1 to now I'm earning +1 if I decide to switch to being idle. So that sort of condition fails there, right? I would not do better by switching my strategies, thus, and this is true for pool 2 as well and for all the other players in the game. So we're at Nash equilibrium. And essentially what it boils down to is like you can expect the game to converge on this. Like all the pools will converge on just choosing to attack one another all the time, which is, it's sad. It's you might hear a situation like this be called a tragedy of the commons, where sort of the universal best case scenario is not the scenario that individual players are incentivized to pursue. Tough, right? So that'll be it for my section. And now I'll hand it over to Erica for forking and double spends. Take it away. Or actually, rather, while Erica's getting set up, I'm also just going to take a quick look at the chat and the Q&A. Let me just make sure there weren't any questions. Okay, we've got one from Kunal here. What does it take for anyone to start a new pool and become a pool owner? Yeah, so Ava said basically anyone can start a pool. This is true. I guess if there are any requirements, it's that like you're not going to have a very successful time doing that unless you have a ton of computational resources to start out with, because you need to give miners some reason to join you as a pool, and that reason is I'm pretty likely to get blocks already, and I'll let you share the rewards of those blocks. But yeah, it looks like all of our questions for that section. So take it away, Erica.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Andrew, for lecturing us so much on mining pools and all that great stuff. I think it's time for me to use this section as an opportunity to talk about two really important concepts and use them as a vehicle for like this conversation we're having about forking and double spends. I'm a mom. And right now, I just sort of want to transition away from discussing ways that miners can cheat versus how individuals can cheat. So like through their own publishing of transactions. And so how the users interact with the protocol and with one another. And oh, sorry, I haven't been sharing my screen, everyone. That's on me. And I guess appropriating Bitcoin, contorting with the protocol. And I'm gonna make sure that before we start, we're actually gonna successfully define forking and double spends for everyone back home who's wondering, because that's an important thing to do. So let me do presenting mode and then share my screen. Sorry. There you go. All right, is everyone seeing what I'm seeing? Okay, let me just go to, there you go. All good. Anyway, let's move on. So now we're talking about, let's talk about Bitcoin Core. So Bitcoin Core is a frequently misunderstood phrase, and it's an open source project. It works on full node software to help fully validate the blockchain and also Bitcoin wallet. And I know you're thinking, wait, this section's on forking and double spends, but promise, this will be relevant later. I highlighted this really interesting graphic that sort of shows the trajectory of how the development flow of Bitcoin Core works. And yeah, it's this team of developers that supervise the Bitcoin GitHub repo, but also the Bitcoin wallet and help fully validate the blockchain. And it's used by, it's like software that these developers design and then Bitcoin nodes fully implement it. Oh no, I'm sorry. There you go. Now we're talking about Bitcoin improvement proposals. So really interesting stuff. So it's basically a formal design document that outlines potential ideas and implementations about Bitcoin, and it informs the community of users about like future possible changes since there's no centralized authority or formal decision-making processes. So basically changes to the network protocol, blocker transaction validation, or anything affecting interoperability have to do with Bitcoin improvement proposals. There's design issues and general guidelines, but those types of Bitcoin improvement proposals are not for proposing new features and don't really represent community consensus. So basically, there's like three types. There's standard track Bitcoin improvement proposals, informational Bitcoin improvement proposals, and process Bitcoin improvement proposals. And the first one dates back like almost a decade ago, 2011. This technology has been around for a while. And I also highlighted a little graphic of the workflow of how a Bitcoin improvement proposal works. There's a lot of discussion, editing happening all the time to really ensure that the best work is being done. And it was highlighted on a really helpful website, and yeah, cool. Now we are getting to what the first half of this section is called, which is forks. So all you need to know is that forks relate to change in network protocol, and nodes that are forking will download and run this new protocol. Let's start with hard forks. So really helpful graphic that I found that is very clean looking and highlights the differences between the two types of forks. So for a hard fork is really just a change in the network where previously invalid transactions or blocks are made valid. What that means is that the rules of the protocol have been loosened. Blocks made by updated mining nodes are accepted by updated mining nodes, but not necessarily by non-updated nodes. Blocks made by non-updated mining nodes are accepted by both updated nodes and non-updated nodes. Onto soft forks. A soft fork is a change in the network in which previously valid transactions or blocks are made valid. What that means is that the rules of the protocol can be pretty restricted and binding, just like not as freeing. So in other words, I guess, blocks made by updated mining nodes are accepted by both updated and non-updated mining nodes. And blocks made by non-updated mining nodes are accepted by non-updated nodes, but not necessarily by updated nodes. And I know that can be a mouthful, but there's some mnemonics, I believe that's the word. It's like things to remember complicated concepts by, but it's definitely out there because sort of you can get confused. But I think also the graphics are really helpful in understanding how the processes of hard forks and soft forks work. So just let me know if there's any questions on that. Now on to double spending. So let's take a step back and review what a double spend is. It's basically just when you are a person who can successfully spend the same value more than once. And we can take this example. So it's $20.99, iPhone is still around, and take Alice, who really wants to buy this new iPhone from Bob on the black market for 100 Bitcoin, but she doesn't want to give up her Bitcoins. But so she's trying to figure out like how she can, use Bob or double spend on Bob. And like Bob has the phone Alice wants, but secretly Alice wants to do something a little sneaky here. So how can she double spend, like spend once and then again? So here's how. She can do a race attack. She can double spend via the race attack. So Bob is very susceptible. He's being naive here because he only checks for a valid transaction and nothing else. So Alice sends a transaction from her to Bob of 100 Bitcoin. And once Bob sees that transaction, he's like, great, let's send the iPhone over. But secretly, Alice is telling the rest of the network that she's actually sending 100 Bitcoin to another address. Everyone in the network hears that. They say, awesome, that's fantastic, Alice. And once the whole blockchain comes to consensus, Bob finds out that his transaction didn't actually go through, but he can't really complain to the network because they think that they see that Alice has broadcasted to them what she intended to do, which was send it to someone other than Bob. So what we've just described is a race attack. And that's when Bob, a vendor, also a victim, immediately accepts a payment from another individual in Bitcoin. And the race attack is occurring if the individual had sent a transaction right to Bob, the victim or the vendor, but had actually broadcasted a different transaction of the payment from the individual to themselves in the network. And in this case, the network is more likely to confirm the individual's transaction to themselves. But that's problematic since the vendor will never even receive the funds from the individual. So Alice has told Bob about her transaction, but she's told everyone else in the network that she's sending that money to herself. That's sort of where we introduce the idea of confirmations. Confirmations at a pretty simple level don't really confirm anything about a transaction, but they relate to the number of blocks that we've added to parts of a block that we're looking at. The block on the left contains my transactions, and there's two confirmations because there's two more blocks on top that have been mined. The most recent block has 0 confirmations because no blocks have really been added to it. And that sort of mentions the topic of block depth. So block depth is basically the number of valid blocks built on top of the current block. And when there's block depth, that means it's a lot harder for an individual to double spend. So let's say an individual wants to double spend, but the vendor who they're really trying to figure out and manipulate requires, let's say X number of confirmations. It's going to be a lot harder for this individual to create a private chain of X valid blocks, including the malicious transaction. Withhold all of these from the network, wait for the vendor to send the goods, and then publish the private chain of their blocks with the malicious transaction so it gets approved by the network with the higher block height. So it's a really, it's sort of an effective preventative measure in some capacity. Now I want to highlight some probability graphs, which after we do some quick analysis will be very insightful. So this slide contains 2 graphs of probability for an attacker to double spend against a transaction. And the first shows the probability that the attacker can catch up, and the inverse shows the opposite. It's the probability of the safety of the vendor given assumptions of attacker hash power. And as we can see with the lower hash powers, each varying color shows the various computational power an attacker might have. And when we see that Q equals 0.1, which is like when an attacker has 10% of the network hash rate, if we wait for 6 confirmations, we can be sure our transaction is reasonably safe. But even then, even when we're waiting for 6 transactions, it gets really shaky when we're near 50%, because that's when somebody's already harnessing like way too much power. And that's why, as we can see with lower hash powers, it's generally safe to say that after 6 confirmations, there's a very low likelihood that the attacker can double spend. But with 50% hash power, we're never really confident that the vendor is safe from a double spend attack. And now this brings us to the 51% attack, which is where we hypothesize what happens when Alice controls more than 50% of the total network. And so if you or Alice, control more than 50% of the network hash rate, then you're always going to be able to double spend, because you'll always be able to create the longest chain, and you'd be in full control of what blocks are included in that chain. So since individuals in the network would just leave the network when they see a 51% attack and subsequently devalue Bitcoin, that's sometimes like a risky decision, but it still happens a lot. Basically, the premise here is that having over 50% of the total network hash power makes someone like almost impossible to be held accounted for with their behavior. And now I sort of want to talk about incentives. So like, honestly, why would Alice, given this amount of power, not want to double spend if she has 51% of the hash rate? I mean, doesn't it sound like a promising prospect for her? But the thing is, there's a variety of different reasons why she wouldn't want to double spend. The first one is if the rest of the network were to catch on to her intentions, confidence in the cryptocurrency and exchange rate would plummet, and it would decrease and diminish, and there would be ASICs that would just be unhelpful and a huge waste of money. Another thing Alice can do, instead of double spending and causing people to have less respect for the currency, is Alice might not physically control the mining hardware that's imperative for her to double spend. But what she could do is simply, Alice could bribe miners to get them to do work for her. She could manipulate entire pools to mine on her withheld chain and figure out some incentive mechanism to have miners operate on her terms. Another idea of incentives, and that's possible, is aforementioned here. So this will hopefully be exciting for everyone, because the concept is really interestingly described. So basically, there's this paper called The Economics of Bitcoin Mining, or Bitcoin in the Presence of Adversaries, which was written by a bunch of economists from Princeton who sort of think about this idea called the Goldfinger attack. And on the slide, there's a picture from the movie Goldfinger, which is a James Bond movie from the 60s. And the main character, the main villain, his name is Arik Goldfinger. And Goldfinger wanted to increase the value of his own gold holdings by making the gold in Fort Knox radioactive and thus worthless. And many aspects of Bitcoin are often described analogous to the gold standard, which I thought made this comparison especially apt. And so now that we've sort of described what a Goldfinger attack is, let's see when that could potentially come into play. So let's say Alice is either a hostile government, an adversarial altcoin, or a large finance institution who has significant capital available to them. those are three similar situations described in this paper, which I would highly recommend you check out. Basically, what happens is that if Alice is in this position where she's one of these three main institutions, it would be up to her to either acquire enough mining ASICs or bribe enough miners to achieve a 50% effective hash power. So that's really touching on what we previously described in the last slide, but we're just giving a name to it now. And yeah, well, that was really all, but now I'm going to pass it on to Andrew to discuss censorship.
Sweet, thank you, Erica. Yeah, it didn't look like there were any questions in the chat or the Q&A, so I'll just get started here. But if there were any, don't worry, we've also got like moderators on taking a look at those. So let's talk about censorship, right? Which in the context of Bitcoin or any currency, any transactional system means you're censoring transactions, right? It's not like you're censoring speech per se. Though they equate, right? You could think about like if we block a journalist from any access to money, they're going to have a really hard time getting the word out about whatever they need to say. Big no-no. So let's set the stage here. So let's say, sort of like in the Goldfinger attack that we just discussed, that Alice is a government or she's got control over a government. Point is, she's got a bunch of mining pools or a very large one, summing to over 51% of the network's hash rate. Things are definitely looking in Alice's favor. So she's got the objective to censor the Bitcoin address owned by Bob and prevent Bob from spending any of his Bitcoin. And so we're going to have some graphics on the following slides. So just like a quick key. So we've got blocks mined by Alice's pools denoted by the A, and they're orange. The pink B blocks are blocks containing Bob's transactions. So the orange blocks, Alice mines them. The pink blocks just contain transactions from Bob. And then the rest of the blocks that don't fit into either of those two categories are just like the gray ones there. So again, Alice wants to prevent Bob from receiving any transactions or from putting any up. So the first strategy, the most like naive, straightforward one, is just simple blacklisting. So Alice will just say, I will never mine a block that contains Bob's transactions. And she has her pools and her miners like agree to this. Will this work? Well, let's take a look. So as you can see in the diagram there, it's not actually going to work out for Alice. It's not going to work out for anyone unless you actually control 100% of the network. By that we mean you're pumping out 100% of the hashes per second. Because otherwise, there's like a non-zero probability that another miner will put up a block, which means that eventually a block that is not yours will come up, which makes room for the eventuality that a block with Bob's transactions will show up. So at best with this strategy, what Alice can do is just sort of delay and inconvenience Bob and make it pretty tough for a transaction to appear on the chain. But this is not an effective use of her massive proportion of mining power. So the second strategy is something called punitive forking. And so in punitive forking, what Alice is going to do is she tells her pools not to mine on any chain that has a block with Bob's transactions. And this is an important bit. She lets the whole world know that this is her strategy. So you can see in the beginnings of the example here, once a block with Bob's transactions in it has been put on the chain, Alice, the next block that her pools make, she, instead of appending it on top of the B block, she'll just fork it off. And so let's see how this plays out for her. So even if other miners in the network were to start mining on top of Bob's chain, it actually doesn't matter that much, right? Like, so you might think that, like, okay, right now the chain with Bob's block is the longest chain. Like, Bob is about to, that is the true ledger. Bob is about to have his transactions come through, yay, good for him. Remember that Alice still controls over 51% of the hash rate. So it's essentially just the law of large numbers playing out. In time, she will mine the longest chain. It's just a matter of how long you're willing to wait. And this is like necessarily true with over 50% of the hash power. So in time, she will mine the longest chain and thus will invalidate Bob's transactions and all of the blocks sort of on the chain that was not hers. And so in time, miners are just going to start mining on top of her chain anyway. In fact, miners are going to be pretty quick to switch because Alice announced this to the world, right? The miners know that she's going to try to fork like this and that she will commit to mining on top of her forked chain. So she's basically told all of the miners, like, it's a guarantee, mine on the chain with Bob's transactions on it, and your blocks will get invalidated. Now, that also means those miners' mining rewards get invalidated, which means they're literally just burning money by running proof of work. So they will switch, and basically the second they see Alice Bob, they're going to default to mining on top of Alice's chain and thus successfully censor Bob, which is something we want Bitcoin to be impervious to. But note that this is only the case when we do have some entity with over 51, or I should say over 50% of the hash rate, which is pretty tough to do. Like, it's actually not very realistic that Alice could amass this. So let's sort of tweak this scenario and say Alice doesn't have 51% of the hash power. Is there still something she can do to try to censor Bob? So there is, and it's a similar strategy called feather forking. So here, similarly, she'll announce to the rest of the world that she's going to attempt to fork in the same exact way as before if she sees a block with transactions from Bob, but she's going to give up on that fork on her own chain after she sees that the block with Bob's transactions has some number K confirmations on top of it. So in this image, for example, it seems she's given up once, like for the value K equals 2, when there are 2 extra blocks on top of Bob's, she says, okay, it's not worth it anymore. As opposed to obviously in the previous example where her strategy was to simply forever keep mining on that fork, because there she could like rest assured that in time she'd have the longest chain. She does not have that assurance anymore. So let's say rather than over 50%, she's got some proportion Q of the mining power. And really we could say here, it's less than 1/2. So it's in that range, like 0 to 1/2. And let's say for the sake of example that she's going to give up after 1 confirmation. So after 1 additional block goes on top of the block with Bob's transactions, she stops her attempt at forking and just says, okay, I guess this time I didn't manage to censor Bob. So her chance of successfully orphaning or invalidating a block with Bob's transactions is Q squared. This is essentially the probability that she... So Bob's block has just come up on the chain. For her to succeed, she needs to put up 2 blocks before any other miner puts up 1 block. The probability that she puts up a block is Q. That's again just the same like proportion of hash rate. And so we're looking for the probability that she puts up the next block and the next block after that. So you get Q squared. And so even for a formidable mining pool of 20% of the network's hash rate, Alice would only have a 4% chance of orphaning a block. This doesn't seem to give her very good odds at successfully invalidating transactions with, Bob's transactions, but it's actually a little bit more powerful than you might expect, because she announced this, and now the other miners know that there's a Q squared chance that their block will be invalidated should they include Bob's transactions in it. So is it still worth it for them to include Bob's transactions in their block? Well, let's break it down. So let's say that in this block, this hypothetical block, so let's say, right, like I'm a miner, I'm a non-Alice miner, and I'm considering whether or not I should include this transaction that I see from Bob in this block that I'm about to start mining. So let's say the block would give me, without Bob's transaction fees, I'd get R reward in total from this block. And let's say that Bob's transaction fees are B, and they would just sort of be appended on top of that. And for simplicity, let's say that like those are my only two options. Like I'm not considering including other miners instead of Bob and like weighing their fees against his. Like let's just stick to this. So the expected value of the expected reward that myself as a miner I would receive if I was to include Bob's transactions in my block is the probability that the block is not invalidated times the total rewards of the block. So the probability that it's not invalidated is 1 minus q squared. Oh, okay, that's slightly wrong. I believe, yeah, it should be, so that squared, that exponent should be inside the parentheses. If someone wants to call me out in the chat because I was wrong just now, feel free to do so, but I'm pretty sure it should be 1 minus q squared. Point is, it's the probability that the block isn't invalidated times the total rewards, whereas if I chose to just exclude Bob's transactions and ignore that, there's no probabilities at play here. If I like successfully mine the block, I will just get the total rewards. There's no chance that it gets invalidated. So for it to be worth it for myself to include Bob's transactions, Bob was going to have to pay some pretty hefty transaction fees to counterset that risk of invalidation. And so if we break out the equations here and do the algebra, basically, we find that Bob's transactions fees have to be greater than or equal to q squared times the like reward of the block otherwise. So for the numbers that we had been using, so Alice controls 20% of the network's hash rate, the reward is 6.25 Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is around 10,000. Bob is going to have to pay at least 2,500 per transaction in just transaction fees to make it worth it for other miners to include his transactions. So it's actually like a pretty effective strategy for how seemingly ineffective it is, given that there's a 4% chance that you actually orphan the block. It's more about just shifting the incentive structure for the other miners. But that's everything we've got for censorship. And now I'll hand it off to Erica to talk about selfish mining, which is a very interesting problem that's more specific to Bitcoin than the others that we have talked about.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm definitely gonna share my screen a lot faster now. All right, let's get to it. Sorry, my computer's so slow. Selfish mining, there we go. Present. Yay, figured out technology. All right, record, share screen. All right, we are rolling. So thank you, Andrew, for a very helpful discussion. I'm going to take it away and start with this section. So right now I'm really trying to, with what I'm going to talk about, explore how rational actors interact within the ecosystem, and how that understanding how those rational actors behaves introduces us to some like game theoretical attacks. So using this section to consider how rational and malicious actors will behave to increase the amount of money they'll make, or if there's a way to increase revenue, assuming they'll do it even if it's not completely fair. One of those examples is selfish mining. So right now I want to highlight block withholding. Let's suppose you're a miner who has just found a block and you decide to keep your block a secret. And I don't know, why would you want to do that? Like, don't you want to share it with the whole world and communicate? Communication's key in an ecosystem. But no, you're trying to give yourself an advantage here. And instead of publishing the block and receiving a reward, you're keeping it secret to yourself. Since you haven't announced the block, you effectively are the only person most recently working on it. And you have 100% of the hash power on your chain. So, I mean, no one else can even attempt to solve the hash puzzle. And so that's sort of like what selfish mining and block withholding entails. And a note, though, is block withholding is also sometimes used in the context of mining pools. And it has to do with like submitting shares, but withholding valid blocks. And on to the next part. So now we're on to this, like the next step in block withholding. It's like, if you succeed in finding a second block, then you've pulled a network. Like if you find a second block before the network even finds the next one, then suddenly you have the longest chain. And you've actually guaranteed yourself at least 2 block rewards, especially if you stay ahead of the honest network, which believes it's mining on the longest chain. And the moment the network finds that it's about to catch up to you, it's up to you to just publish the hidden chain and invalidating the honest chain. And since honest nodes will always choose the longest chain, that really just denies the network that's honest to do any meaningful work. And if you're succeeding, then you're fooling the network and you can continue to mine on your own chain because you can broadcast at any time and win. Yeah, so, but if like while the network is working on an invalid block, there was so much time for you to develop like the mining you were working on for free. And you had no competition, so you had a higher proportion of the hash rate, and that led to higher returns. So the assumption is that you are finding your 2 blocks before the network finds the next block. Otherwise, it's just a waste of your work. But once the network almost catches up on their chain, it's up to you to publish your secret longer chain. And so like you, being a malicious actor, are getting free time to mine out of competition with other miners. And while others thought they were mining on the longest chain, you actually have the longest chain. And so all that free time mining on the network, as I previously said, is just like allowed you to acquire more work and spend more time on yourself. And now that you have a higher effective proportion of the hash rate, you're also going to have higher expected profits. And now we're talking about like how there's a race to propagate. So I was sort of highlighting before about what happens if like the network found a new block before you could find a second one. And you really, really don't want that to happen. Like you want to find 2 blocks before the network is even onto you. But well, it's really dependent on your mining percentage. But you could lose the race every time and still make a profit. If on average, let's say you manage to tell 50% of the network about your block first, malicious strategy is more profitable if you have over 25% of the mining power. But the actual math in this slide is omitted due to complexity. But if you're really interested in that, I'd recommend checking it out after you really preliminarily understand it. The most like core concepts of selfish mining and stuff like that. But I think it's just a really mind-boggling idea that, you know, dependent on your mining percentage, if it is above 33%, it's still going to be profitable to be malicious, even if you're losing the race every time, which I don't know if that's too enjoyable for someone to just like, be just willingly losing and trying to gain something out of it. That was a really short section, and that was still me ad-libbing it, but now it's up to Andrew to go off on selfish mining defenses, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thank you. All right, do we see my slides? I think we should. Yeah, thanks for that intro. Selfish mining, yeah, I remember when I learned about this, I thought it was one of the most fascinating, well, it was the most fascinating thing I'd learned about Bitcoin to that point, because I thought, you know, Satoshi Nakamoto had it figured out. He's got an airtight incentive structure. And even though, or sorry, I shouldn't even say he, we don't know anything about Satoshi Nakamoto, but even though the incentive structure isn't airtight, as we've seen with selfish mining existing, there's still ways that we as a community can try to disincentivize it and fight back in the same way that you know, Bitcoin would expect us to, with economic incentives and whatnot. And with cryptography, actually, that's going to be our first sort of approach. So this dubbed certification of witness, this is an approach proposed by, I'm not going to pretend like I know, or like I remember the first name, but by Schultz in 2015. And it's sort of it makes sense. It's if you're like brainstorming, this might be sort of what you come up with, where, okay, like if the issue is that when we selfish mine, other miners like don't see that we're mining on a block and can't mine on top of it to try to like, you know, hop onto our chain. What if we just make sure that every single block that is ever published was seen while it was being mined? And how do we do that in the land of Bitcoin and blockchain? Well, we'd place a signature on it, right? That would signify that during its creation, other nodes had witnessed it because before it gets put on the chain, they put their signature on it so we can verify which node it was and that it actually was that node, claiming that it saw this block being put up. Great, cool. Like that seems to make sense. And the way we would do this is to essentially select a random subset of nodes for every block and say it's your responsibility to sign off on this block. And then when it comes time to like when that block gets published to the chain and other miners are verifying it, they'll make sure that the necessary nodes had signed off on it. And this would be proof that it was witnessed. So there's a couple of demands that this places on the Bitcoin protocol that aren't very reasonable. The first is that we need a way to choose a random subset of nodes. And in that vein, we also need to know which nodes were assigned to a given block. You might be asking yourself, like, why in the first place are we doing this random subset of nodes thing? Like, why can't I just say that 80% of the network needs to have signed off on this block? So that's not Sybil resistant, as we call it. It's vulnerable to a Sybil attack, which is an attack in which, you know, the system can be taken advantage of by someone that's creating multiple entities. So if I was selfishly mining and I know that like, 80% of nodes have to sign off on my blocks for them to be considered valid, let me just like spin up like hundreds of thousands of nodes and just have them sign off on my own blocks. And basically spin up so many nodes that it would hit that proportion threshold anyway. So to prevent that from happening, the only other way of assuring that like enough of the network had the chance to see the blocks is to pick a random subset. But when we pick a random subset, we need to know which subset was picked for a block, and that introduces reliance on something called an oracle, which if any of you come from like a software engineering background, oracles are pretty much like APIs, except they also do some fancy stuff like verifying data and authenticating and all this like secure stuff. But point is, we need an oracle, some external party that will say, these are the nodes that I've chosen for a given block. And when other miners are trying to validate a block, they need to go to an oracle and say like, hey, can you tell me which nodes were assigned to this block? Because otherwise I won't be able to validate it. And the reason we need an oracle here is because that information is simply not included in the Bitcoin protocol right now. So like it's just at a, like a pure data level, the blocks they're not set up to contain like witness signatures in this way. And if we wanted that to be done, that would require a hard fork. But there is like no part of the node software that knows to like interface with oracles or which oracles to find to do this like random selection of blocks. So point is like, there's not really a clean way to implement this that isn't like Sybil, non-Sybil resistant, and that isn't hard fork inducing. And like the most effective way to implement this solution otherwise forces us to rely on oracles, which if we can keep that out of the equation, would keep things much more stable and predictable for the protocol. So another strategy to disincentivize selfish mining was proposed by Lir Bahak in 2013. He was actually beaten to the punch by, I think, a matter of weeks by a couple of other researchers, AL and Serrer, who I think we also quote their work in the next slide. So it's funny, they were like really racing to highlight basically selfish mining as a problem and their respective solutions to it. A little bit of interesting, I don't know, research drama. But the whole point here is that rather than the cryptographic approach where we have these verifiable signatures, these statements of witness for every block. Let's use economic incentives instead. And the idea is if a fork occurs, what you can do as a miner is in the next block that you manage to put on the chain, the current longest chain, you can include a proof and say, hey, look back a couple of blocks. I can prove to you that a fork actually occurred here because here are like both branches that forked off of this one like originating block. And if you can include that proof, what happens is that in the winning side of the fork, so in this example, that is the orange blocks. In the winning side of the fork, so the blocks that were included in like the proof of the fork, which in our case would just be like a number of blocks equal to the number contained on the other fork. So here, those first two blocks, they get slashed. So what happens is like, oh, you've been included in a proof of forking. Basically, we're going to assume that you forked that maliciously. And so the original creators of those blocks, which in a selfish mining scenario would be the one selfish pool, get none of the rewards, none of them. And the block or the miner that put up the block with the proof of the fork, which is the last block on the bottom chain here, this miner would get half of the total forfeited rewards. And of course, the two blocks, the two gray blocks on the upper chain here, they never really get rewards because they're invalidated by the blockchain. So the idea here is that we can, like if I was a miner that was working on the top chain there, like sort of happy-go-lucky, and then out of nowhere, like my blocks keep getting beat out by this selfish miner, I can, once the selfish miner like wins over, I can mine my next block on the selfish miner's chain, include this proof and be like, look, like this person like cheated me out of my money, and then I would get their money. So this heavily disincentivizes selfish mining for miners because they're liable to lose basically all of the rewards that they might have made, except for any additional blocks that they beat the length of the other chain by. So like that third orange block in this example. The point is we take the money away from the selfish miner. The drawback here is that honest miners are liable to get caught in the crossfire because forks can happen in non-malicious ways naturally, and it's not a result of selfish mining. It's just like block propagation. Like two miners mine blocks at the same time and they both share it with the network. Different parts of the network hear about the blocks in different orders, and that'll essentially like force a fork. And then those miners might also lose their rewards if someone who's keeping the chain under tight scrutiny puts up a proof of fork. So it's not great that the miners honest miners might be affected. Also, in the decision to sort of axe half of the rewards in the selfish chain, so like half of the rewards will go to the miner that proved there was a fork. The other half of the rewards go nowhere. They are just sort of destroyed. And this is like a pretty strong change to the intended monetary policy or the original monetary policy for Bitcoin, which is that, every block has this block reward. This is the way that we mint new money into the system. Bitcoin does not disappear from the system technically. And we know that we'll hit a finite cap of 21 million Bitcoin. But now it's like, oh, Bitcoin might disappear from the system whenever someone forks, if someone calls them out on that fork. We no longer have like a predictable model for the evolution of Bitcoin supply. And it's just, it's like, obviously the community isn't going to pounce at changes to the fundamental like economic structure of Bitcoin. This would also require a hard fork, unfortunately. And for all the innovation that it brings, it also doesn't like completely prevent selfish mining, which is all right, but this requires a hard fork. It makes fundamental changes to the monetary policy, and it still doesn't really solve the problem, because if an attacker publishes a selfishly mined chain that's like 1.5 times as long as the competing one, they'll still actually make profit in the end. That's incredibly unlikely, but it's a possibility. So the last defense that we'll be talking about, and it's a surprisingly straightforward one, but it's fairly strong, and it's simple uniform tie breaking. So in the event of a tie, which is like when we see a fork occur of like 2 equal lengths, so there is not a winning chain yet, miners are just going to choose randomly which part of the fork they mine on. Now, we actually haven't mentioned this, but currently in the Bitcoin protocol, how miners choose which part of a fork to mine on is they'll choose whichever block they heard about first, whichever one like, yeah, that's how it works. Whichever one they had heard about first, they choose that one to mine on top of, which means that an attacker with great network connectivity, like I'm talking an attacker that can basically, if they choose to broadcast a block, they can get it to you instantaneously. They would always win in this situation because every time they put up a fork, they're super well connected, so they can make sure that their block in the fork is the one that all the other miners hear about first, and they can just take advantage of the algorithm's current implementation where like, okay, the first block is the one that they choose to mine on. So myself as a very well-connected attacker, they're all going to choose to mine on my chain. But now we're saying, let's have miners choose randomly instead of doing that. And this is actually the same math that Erica was referencing when she was talking about selfish mining. And I certainly suggest that you search up this paper by Ale and Serrer if you want to really get the breakdown of how the math works. But under this new strategy of uniform tie breaking, an attacker would need to actually control at least 25% of the network's hash rate for selfish mining to be more profitable than honest mining in all cases. So like even in the case where, even in the case where no miners choose to mine on the attacker's chain. I don't want to actually, I'm not going to make that claim now, and I'll be sure to elaborate in the Facebook post because this definitely gets into the nitty gritty of the math and the research paper, and I don't want to mislead anyone. But basically, the important point to note there is that right now, an attacker that doesn't control a large proportion of the network, that controls even 0%, let's say, of the total hash rate, if they're that optimally connected attacker and they can get blocks that they make in front of other miners before anyone else, they're always going to choose to selfish mine instead of honest mine because the expected value is always going to be more profitable in that case where they know they can get their blocks sort of in front of everyone else's. But now when we take away that assurance from them, they're going to need at least 25% of the network's hash rate to choose to selfishly mine over honest mine because otherwise the expected value for honest mining will be higher. However, the paper also goes on to show that for a miner with at least 33% of the hash rate, selfish mining will always be more profitable for them than honest mining. And by always here, we mean like no matter how much of the rest of the network chooses to mine on their chain, even if it's just them mining on their selfish chain and none of the other, this gets into the semantics of actual selfish mining strategies, but point is they can completely independently without having to hope that their chain once published gets picked up by the rest of the network. They can completely independently selfishly mine and in expectation have more profit than honest mining. So that's like a sort of threshold capacity where like, okay, if we get someone with at least 33% of the hash rate in the network right now, we can assume, and we should assume, that they will always selfishly mine. And that's actually, so that's it for us today. We're pretty much on time, which I'm happy about. And I know these last few sections were probably a little more, in the weeds. So definitely feel free to stick around if you want, drop some questions for us. And also look out on the Facebook page for clarifications and a summary of the questions. But that should be it from us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I believe James asked if there's somewhere we can access the slides. If I'm correct, in the group Facebook, we upload a recording and draft of the Q&A questions and also our slides. So James, I think it would be great if you joined that group. Solve your query.
Rob, I see your question about Chinese mining pools having more than 50%. I've heard whisperings about this. I've heard, hypotheses. It's you can't really confirm you can't place an upper bound on the hash power that they have. But just for those of you following along, this isn't a confirmed statement at all that Chinese mining pools control over 50% of the hash power. Because also I don't think mining pools necessarily care about national boundaries and political association that much. Yeah, just folks in the country. I'm totally with you, Rob, 100%. So there's not any guarantee that they're not selfishly mining. Unfortunately, we can't know. I mean, we can try to patrol the chain and make sure that there aren't like too many consecutive blocks essentially from these pools, but just given their sheer size, there's like a strong enough probability of that anyway. So, I mean, I hate to tell you, like basically the answer is we can't know that whether or not they're selfishly mining with a very strong degree of confidence. But I wouldn't assume that pools collaborate in this way. I really like this slide that we had earlier in the lecture that said like if someone tries to double spend, that would destroy confidence in the network and crash the value of the currency. And so in a circular way, you don't want to double spend because you've just double spent a currency that you successfully like brought its value to zero. And I think that would sort of bear a similar situation where if we see that pools are collaborating to essentially control an over 50% majority, that would destroy confidence in the network and in a sense disincentivize pools from actually trying to do that, or at least get them to try to be very secretive about it. Hope that provided some context.
Rob, also your question, there's been a lot of research from Ripple with a couple reports that really highlight how mining occurs in those regions. I'm gonna pull them up for you and send them in the chat.
Hey, Sahan. So making sure I'm understanding your question here. So I remember your question about like, is there any way to, police against bad actors that double spend or try to censor? And so you're saying, yes, yeah, okay. So you're saying, yeah. So first of all, if we find that a node is trying to cheat the system, or we find that a node is malicious, unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of value to us. Even if we could do something with that and like block that node, they're free to make a new identity and go through a number of transactions to get their Bitcoin to that new identity in a very difficult to trace way. And then they could just go back to doing malicious things and we would never know that it was like the same malicious person controlling those two nodes. So yes, the high level approach that we take in the Bitcoin community is to assume that people will try to cheat the system like aggressively in every way that they can, and do our hardest to, yes, disincentivize it and essentially ensure that all the actors are incentivized to do things that help the system as a whole, as opposed to, affect it negatively. And that's a very difficult problem to balance all those incentives. As we've shown, there's flaws in it.
Oh, there's a sort of off-topic question, but one that was pretty funny. It's asking me what the sticker is above my New Yorker poster. Well, first off, that poster is like, it's this joke that New Yorkers think they're at the center of the world, but they're not. And then on top, it says, how I learned to avoid my problems and start hammering. And it's just this person hammering on their floor. Yeah, that's really all.
The morning motivation. All right, let's see. Oh, I see another question from Moises. Let's see. So do you have a video or something real to see how an attack goes and how the pool prevents its network from it? So no, I don't. That's interesting. I've never really seen an attack play out in any tangible way, and I'm afraid that if I could find a video, if one existed, it wouldn't be very exciting. It would probably look something like someone scrolling through, or like basically like querying a bunch of blocks on the Bitcoin blockchain and doing something like, yeah, you see this block was made by this pool. Oh, let's go to the next one. Oh, you see this block was made by this pool too. It's probably selfish mining. You'd probably get really bored in 5 minutes. I'm sorry that it's like, it's hard to think about these things in just theoretical terms. But especially for these sorts of attacks, it's hard to put it in some sort of tangible format, unfortunately.
Ooh, a couple more questions have popped up. Did we answer the question about how an attack goes and how the pool prevents its network from it?
Yeah, that was just me saying that we don't have a video, unfortunately. Yeah, all of these have been answered.
Okay, great.
Cool. Yeah, totally feel free to go now. Not chewing you off by any means. I love answering the questions. I just see a good number of participants. I don't want anyone to think that they have to stay.
Stephen, is all malicious activity able to be discovered in a reasonable amount of time? I wouldn't say so. I don't think it's always a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah, I wouldn't say so either. Like depending, if selfish mining is a great example, depending on the strategy used. So like I could contrive a scenario where if an attacker has a lot of hash power, they could probably get a pretty long selfish chain going, and then post the whole thing at one point way in the future. And it would be difficult to discover in a reasonable amount of time from like the start of the selfish mining. Like the second a selfish mining chain goes up, yeah, pretty much everyone in the network will know about this in approximately a minute. But they might have started that selfish mining chain like many blocks ago, right? It really depends on the type of attack or malicious activity.
Google Thank you, Douglas. Thank you for that. Thank you for that soundbite. I will certainly do the same.
This is legit. Yeah, Ethereum Classic got its third 51% attack. That's hype.
Oh, Varn has a good question. These attacks are applicable for every blockchain implementation. Is it Bitcoin only?
Yeah, I think that depends on the attack as well. So double spending is something that's kind of like, for example, it's kind of foundational to digital currencies. Like any digital currency has to solve that attack. But selfish mining is pretty specific. Ooh. It depends on the consensus algorithm at play. Like selfish mining, at least the way we've looked at the attack here, it's going to be applicable to any proof of work blockchain. Um, but know that a lot of the times, so I would say like the attacks that we've discussed, at least at a high level in this lecture, are pretty universally applicable, more so definitely focused on proof of work blockchains. But it really does depend on, honestly, the implementation specifics of the blockchain. Like, for example, in that defense to selfish mining on uniform tie breaking. So the honestly like the a large part of its defensive value was derived from the fact that it like changed this small implementation detail in Bitcoin where we'll like start mining on the first block that we hear about in a fork. And that's like a very specific thing to Bitcoin that ended up enabling a sort of family of attacks for well-connected actors that in other blockchains that maybe by default randomize which fork you mine on, it, like attacks would play out in different ways or could be taken advantage of to different extents. I hate that. Like, I think my last three answers in a row have basically been like, it depends, but it does. I hate to say it. You kind of just like, you always have to dig a bit deeper. Nikhil asks, does Byzantine fault tolerant consensus solve the double spend? Essentially, yeah. Yeah, they're sort of unrelated. Actually, let's see. No, yeah, like a double spend is yeah, I guess you could say that because a double spend is an example of Byzantine behavior. You're lying about the consensus state. That's like it's something we'll talk about, and I want to say in the next lecture what Byzantine fault tolerance is and whatnot. Anyone else that's following along, just sort of putting it in more academic terms, the things we've already been talking about. But yeah, the fact that we have Byzantine fault tolerant consensus also allows us, or that same consensus is what prevents double spends. I wouldn't conflate the two. And then Moises asks, which are the most famous mining pools and how does someone join them? Let me drop a link in the chat. There's a website, I think it's literally blockchain.com / like pools or something. And it shows you that, wow, that literally worked. Here, actually, let me share my screen onto it. These are the biggest pools by hash rate in the network today. This is very, this definitely helps me sleep at night. The fact that this chunk of the network is just unknown. Although I think that just means that it's like not any one pool and not that it's one single entity. But it looks like the biggest pools here are F2 pool, Poolin. I've heard of Huobi pool. So I feel like it's been, well, these have all probably been players in the game for a while, but yeah, there you go. I think we can also see it broken down by, oh no, these are completely different metrics. And as far as what it would take to join a pool, I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you. You'd probably want to, I'm sure they have a website you could probably go to that'll tell you like the address of the pool operator or something and some handshake protocol to get you, into the pool. But you'd probably have to do a bit of searching for that. Yeah, all right. It looks like we've kind of tapered off on the questions. Thanks everyone for sticking around for today's lecture and for all the very engaging questions at the end. I love to see that our students are paying attention.
Yeah, thank you so much for letting us preach the gospel of game theory and attacks to you guys. Have a great Thursday, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.